where 22.2 million people are about, or about 75% of the population, are in need of some kind of humanitarian or protection assistance in 2018. Or Syria, where we have around 13.1 million people requiring humanitarian assistance, 3 million of which are trapped in displaced and hard to reach safe areas. To Palestine, where 16,499 were injured between 30th of March and 19th of July. 4,488 of which were women and children. Irresponsible and illicit arms transfers fuel devastating conflicts, humanitarian crises, human rights violations, and untold destruction and human suffering. This side event will discuss ongoing transfers of military equipment to the Middle East region, with panelists presenting research and findings, assessing their compliance with the aim and purpose of the ATT, though recognizing that not all arms being supplied are by ATT states parties. There is still a role for states parties to ensure that they are enforcing the treaty. There is also a clear need for applying political pressure on those who continue to supply arms in violation of international humanitarian law and human rights law, including signatories and non-states parties. The side event seeks to examine the evidence and make a case that the risk of misuse remains high, and consequently why arms transfers to these governments need to stop. The panel will also explore how the treaty's universalization and robust implementation in this region could prevent the flow of arms into the region and contribute to efforts to ensure peace and security. Our first speaker will be Frank Slijper. Frank Slijper works at peace organization, PAX, in the Netherlands, where he leads the arms trade project. Much of his current work relates to arms transfers and the use of weapons in the Middle East and the Horn of Africa. In his presentation this morning, he will elaborate on recent cases of diversion of weapons in Iraq, Syria, and Libya. Please, Frank, the floor is yours.
Very much, Adi. And thank you all for being here so early in the morning. The advantage of which is that you are, of course, crisp, fresh, and full of energy. In my contribution, indeed, I will provide a few examples of cases of diversion of military equipment to the MENA region that have emerged in recent years and are, of course, of special relevance in the context of this year's extra focus on diversion. And I'll briefly refer here to 3 cases of diversion that deal with one, diversion to Iraq's militia, which fought against so-called Islamic State over the past few years. Another one is about weapons diverted to that same Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and a final one on unauthorized UAE arms retransfers of weapons to Libya. So the first case I want to talk about was researched by a number of media and civil society organizations over the past 3 years, and included research of how numerous types of weapons have been diverted to Iraqi militia fighting Islamic State alongside Iraqi regular troops from 2014 onwards. These predominantly Shiite militia, also known as the Popular Mobilization Units, or PMU, have used these weapons to commit war crimes, revenge attacks, and other atrocities against mostly Iraqi Sunnis. Already in 2015, a video showed a large Kataib Hezbollah convoy with American-made military vehicles, including, for example, an M1 Abrams Abrams tank, and 113 armored personnel carriers, Humvees, other US-made vehicles, as well as Iranian-made Safir 4x4 armored vehicles. Ironically indeed, alongside US-made military equipment, Iran is a major supplier to Iraq and on to the PMU, including Iranian-made anti-tank guns as well as different types of mortars. And despite the earlier reports of transfers to the PMU, the United States started to continue delivering many millions, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of military equipment under the supervision of the government of Iraq. And reportedly, the major beneficiaries of the weapon deliveries have been these popular mobilization forces. In a report published last year, Amnesty International found that the PMU inventories included arms and ammunition manufactured in at least 16 countries, including Chinese, European, Iraqi, Iranian, Russian, and US small arms and light weapons, rockets, artillery systems, and armored vehicles. Its research revealed that the PMU militias had used their arsenal to commit or facilitate serious human rights violations across central and northern Iraq. While Iran and maybe the US as well had foreseen or even intended, though maybe for different reasons, the transfer of the weapons to the militia, this likely has not been the case for some other countries. And even though the militias have recently been integrated in Iraq's armed forces, questions of impunity and illicit retransfers remain. Therefore, supplying states that have seen weapons being diverted to the militia without their consent should require steps from Baghdad to ensure that these weapons return to army stocks, and all necessary measures are taken against militia members that have committed atrocities. The second example, I want to mention the case of diversion of weapons to a host of anti-government groups in Syria and in many cases onwards to the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. There's been extensive research been done by Conflict Armament Research, published late last year, and focusing on these flows of arms and ammunition ending up with Islamic State. And maybe the more special kind of diversion in this case is the capture by Islamic forces of significant quantities of NATO weaponry during their initial assaults on Iraqi forces in 2014, especially in Mosul. But also, and that's publicly known, there have been significant unauthorized retransfers that have been significant sources of IS weapons and ammunition. The United States and Saudi Arabia supplied most of this material without authorization and apparently coming from a range, apparently to a range of Syrian opposition forces. This diverted material recovered from ISIS forces comprises exclusively Warsaw-backed caliber weapons and ammunition purchased by the United States and Saudi Arabia from European Union and other European states in Eastern Europe, Eastern and Southern Europe, I must say. Also, Conflict Armament Research found that nearly 40% of all anti-armor rockets deployed by ISIS forces in Iraq were produced as late as in the years 2014 to 17. EU member states produced nearly 20% of these rockets, and 40% of rockets found of EU origin were manufactured since 2010. A fact that sits uncomfortably with the EU's parallel efforts to degrade the group's capacity to wage war and terrorism and to mitigate the international effects of the Syrian conflict. I also want to highlight research that has been done by the Balkan Investigative Research Network, known as by the acronym BIRN, on the link between Southeast European origin arms and ammunition diverted to various groups in Syria. And I strongly recommend you to look at their work, which is really unmatched for the region. Finally, my third example, I want to highlight the involvement of the United Arab Emirates in numerous arms transfers to Libya in violation of the UN arms embargo. These have been mostly retransfers of weapons originally supplied to the UAE by other countries. And last year, Pax described some of these cases in a report, of which there's still a few copies on the table. And one of these cases, for example, concerns an M24 attack helicopter delivered to General Haftar's Libyan National Army in eastern Libya in April 2015. And the following quote comes from the UN panel of experts. Belarus has confirmed to the panel that an Mi-24P helicopter with such markings had been transferred to the United Arab Emirates in 2014 as part of a delivery of 4 Mi-24s. Belarus had issued an end-user certificate and registered the transfer in the United Nations Register of Conventional Arms of 2015. The committee did not receive an exemption request for the transfer of this helicopter, nor has Belarus received any request by the United Arab Emirates for authorization of re-export of the helicopters. The panel has sent a letter to the United Arab Emirates asking for detailed information on the transfer of the attack helicopter to Libya, but has not received a response. End of quote. Since 2016, a number of aircraft have been transferred to Kadim Airport, 100 kilometers from Benghazi, which has been extensively developed. The base's inventory of UAE air assets was revealed in October 2016 by Jane's Defense Weekly, showing 6 AT-802 light attack aircraft, Black Hawk helicopters, Chinese-made Wing Loon drones capable of carrying guided weapons, as well as an Ilyushin 76 transport aircraft. The aircraft are crucial to Haftar's forces, which, like other factions, have few or no air weapons. In its 2016 report, the UN panel of experts included a leaked email from the UAE's Ministry of Foreign Affairs admitting that, quote, the fact of the matter is that the UAE violated the Security Council resolution on Libya and continues to do so, end of quote, but would not submit written requests to the United Nations Security Council, risking denial and exposing, quote, how deeply involved we are in Libya, and will also hinder our interest in Libya, end of quote. Regardless, the numerous documented violations of the arms embargo had little or no consequences. These 3 recent batches of cases of diversion in the MENA region represent a wider problem of unaccountability of weapons that come from states with perfectly well-organized export control systems and capable officials executing national policies in both ATT member states and non-member states alike. As these examples also show, diversion is not necessarily about dodgy arms brokers and dealers shipping weapons under false pretext to warlords. Oftentimes diversion is a practice organized or at least condoned by state actors, arming proxies to do the dirty work they cannot or will not do to support their political agenda. State actors that are often close allies of the countries of origin of the weapons. Therefore, it's key that exporting states, as part of their rigorous risk assessment of an export license request, require end-user certificates from the intended recipient, which at least would require permission from the exporting states prior to any change in ownership or retransfer to a different end user. And when it still happens, ensure that potential loopholes are plugged, legal steps are taken to hold violators to account. Moreover, relevant exporting states could do more in the field of cooperation with other states, as well as with researchers and civil society, taking stock of lessons learned in the recent past. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Frank, for such a comprehensive exposition for the arms flow in our region, unfortunately. Our second speaker will be Rasha Abdurrahim. Rasha is a researcher, advisor on arms control and human rights, and artificial intelligence and human rights at Amnesty International Secretariat in London. Please, Rasha. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you again for being here, especially so early in the morning. So I'm going to talk about the recent protests in Gaza and the humanitarian impact of that. I'm going to talk a little bit about the injuries that were sustained by the protesters, the long-term impact of that. I'm also going to talk about some of the weapons that were used, the exports that we've seen going to Israel and Palestinian armed groups. And then I'm going to apply an arms trade treaty assessment to the situation and demonstrate that there's an overriding risk that any arms transfers to this region could result in serious violations. So since the 30th of March, several groups in the Gaza Strip organised a series of demonstrations and marches along the fence that separates Gaza and Israel. The protests were against Israel's 11-year closure of the Gaza Strip and also to commemorate the expulsion and flight of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians during Israel's establishment, which is referred to as the Nakba, or the catastrophe. The day before the protests, Israeli forces announced the deployment of 100 snipers to the border, as well as increased security in the form of tanks and drones. The Israeli military stated that it had enforced an enclosed military zone in areas near the fence that separates Israel and Gaza, and it gave orders to shoot anyone within several hundred meters of the fence. So, according to the latest World Health Organization, WHO, figures, since the 30th of March, at least 160 Palestinians have been killed during the weekly Friday protests, and approximately 18,000 have been injured. To date, among those injured were some 9,500 who were hospitalized, of which over 4,000 had suffered injuries after being hit by live ammunition. Some were hospitalized due to tear gas inhalation, rubber bullets. Some suffered injuries to the legs and the knees. Some sustained injuries to the head and the neck, and some to the upper body, and others suffered injuries in the chest and the back. Most of those targeted were men, but there were also women and children. So Hamas leaders have been blamed for the deaths, and there were claims that those killed were trying to cross the fence or were referred to as main instigators. The vast majority of protesters were unarmed, but reports indicate that some Palestinian protesters threw stones, Molotov cocktails, burnt tires, and tried to damage the fence. In one instance, 4 armed men fired at Israeli forces in northern Gaza. This happened on the 14th of May, and according to the UN, 4 Israeli soldiers have been lightly wounded in the Gaza protests. But most of the fatal cases analysed by Amnesty International, including eyewitness testimonies, as well as video and photographic evidence, suggest that many of the protesters were killed or injured while posing no imminent threat to Israeli forces. Some of the cases documented by Amnesty International appear to be willful killing, which is a grave breach of the Geneva Conventions and potentially a war crime. In addition, Israeli forces used high-velocity military-grade weapons and ammunition against Palestinian protesters who posed no imminent threat to life, while apparently targeting the lower limbs, causing horrific and life-changing injuries. Doctors at the European and Shifa hospitals in Gaza City told Amnesty International that many of the serious injuries that they sustained were due to the lower limbs, including knees, which were typical of war wounds that they had not observed since the 2014 Gaza conflict. Now, according to military experts as well as a forensic pathologist who reviewed photographs of injuries that were obtained by Amnesty International, many of the wounds observed by the doctors in Gaza are consistent with those of high-velocity Israeli-manufactured Tabor rifles. Other wounds bear the hallmarks of US-manufactured M24 Remington sniper rifles shooting 7.62mm hunting ammunition, which expand and mushroom in the body. And so as a result, many protesters suffered extreme bone and tissue damage, as well as large exit wounds measuring between 10 and 15mm, and according to doctors, will likely face further complications, infections, and some physical disability, including paralysis and amputation. So far, the injuries have resulted in 72 amputations, including 14 of children and 1 woman. Many people are still at risk of amputation of the lower limbs, and others will require long-term rehabilitation and maybe at risk of long-term disability. And so just to set this in context, according to the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, or UN OCHA, it's estimated that over 1,400 Palestinians may suffer from long-term disability due to the severity of the injuries incurred. And in February, even before the protests occurred, the WHO warned that Gaza's health system was on the brink of collapse, and that these casualties have further strained Gaza's already overloaded healthcare system to breaking point. So a lot of these protesters are not going to be able to access the healthcare that they need and the rehabilitation that they need, which will aggravate their recovery, and they may never fully recover. Now, moving on to our position on arms transfers to Israel and Palestinian armed groups. I want to begin by saying that Israel, as all governments, has the right to defend its borders and to deploy lethal force to protect against an imminent threat to life. However, this is conditional on legal obligations that serve to limit this use of force. Specifically, as the occupying power, Israel must uphold the rights of Palestinians to peaceful protest and freedom of expression. And when policing protests, Israeli forces may only resort to force for legitimate purposes, and such force must be to the minimum extent necessary. The use of lethal force must be the last resort, not the first resort. In any event, lethal force must never be used against peaceful protesters, and shooting unarmed protesters who haven't reached its frontier is disproportionate and potentially unlawful. So in light of the recent unlawful killings in Gaza, Amnesty International renewed its long-standing call for the imposition of an immediate, comprehensive arms embargo on Israel, Hamas, and other Palestinian armed groups, until there's effective accountability and no longer a substantial risk that the arms could be used for serious violations of IHRL and IHL, meaning International Human Rights Law and International Humanitarian Law. Now, Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups have also previously committed serious violations of international law, including possible war crimes in indiscriminate rocket attacks which have targeted towns and villages in southern Israel. The US is by far Israel's main supplier of military equipment and technology, and it has a commitment to provide $38 billion worth of military aid over the next 10 years. And Israeli forces deploy a variety of US manufactured small arms and ammunition and less lethal crowd control equipment. According to publicly available arms transfer information, the US has exported tens of millions of dollars worth of small arms and related components, ammunition, and toxicological agents, including tear gas and riot agents. Other countries, including EU member states, have also licensed large quantities of military equipment for Israel. This includes equipment such as small arms, light weapons, aircraft, armored vehicles, as well as parts and components for military combat vehicles, tanks, shotguns, or rifles. Similarly, reports indicate that Iran has provided arms manufacturing know-how to Hamas in Gaza, including both financial and military support. And Hamas fighters have previously admitted to firing Iranian-type Fajr-5 missiles towards Tel Aviv, but they also mostly fire shorter-range homemade Qassam rockets. Now, setting this in context of the ATT, so as I've explained, Amnesty's position is we're calling for a comprehensive arms embargo. So, from our perspective, Article 6 would apply here, so there should be a prohibition on all arms transfers given the war crimes that we've documented over a long period of time. Having said that, there are states, including states, parties and signatories who continue to license arms exports to Israel. And so I'm just going to take this through an Article 7 risk assessment and demonstrate that there is an overriding risk of serious violations by continuing to license these exports. So under Article 7 of the ATT, an objective and non-discriminatory assessment of the risks of serious violations of international human rights and humanitarian law, using verifiable and detailed information from credible and reliable sources, must be undertaken. Article 7.1a of the ATT acknowledges that arms exports have the potential to contribute to or to undermine international security, peace and security. Certain types of conventional arms can be legitimately acquired by states to exercise lawful use of force consistent with international law enforcement standards. Similarly, conventional arms cannot contribute to peace and security if they're used to violate relevant international law, referred to in the principles in the preamble of the treaty, which includes the UN Charter, for example, UN Charter obligations. Now, an assessment of whether an export could contribute to or undermine peace and security should include, for example, whether the recipient state is involved in an international or non-international armed conflict, or whether it is under preliminary examination by the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, or ICC. The starting point for assessing there is a serious risk, serious violation of IHRL or IHL could occur is to examine the recipient state's respect for these. States must then determine whether there have been previous serious violations of IHRL or IHL using the arms or related equipment under review, and also assess whether there is a risk that the violations are likely to be facilitated or committed by those arms. This requires assessing the end user and their propensity for violating IHRL or IHL, and or their capacity for using arms lawfully. Now, a crucial question is whether there exists a state of impunity with regard to previous violations. States must then consider whether there are effective measures that could be undertaken to mitigate the risk of serious violations. And finally, states must assess whether there's an overriding risk of serious violations of international human rights or humanitarian law. The likelihood of overriding risk becomes greater where there is evidence of a pattern of serious violations, or where the recipient state has not taken appropriate steps to end systematic violations to ensure accountability for those violations and prevent their recurrence. Now, as I've said, both Israeli forces and Palestinian armed groups have a long history of impunity for unlawful killings and indiscriminate attacks targeting civilians, including potential war crimes. In addition, in January 2015, the Office of the Prosecutor of the ICC opened a preliminary examination into the situation of the occupied Palestinian territories. Therefore, looking at past and present conduct of all sides, as well as the fact that there is this preliminary investigation by the ICC, should raise serious questions to states who continue to supply arms to Israel and Palestinian armed groups. Systematic violations spanning decades by all sides demonstrate that there's an overriding risk that arms exports to Israel, Hamas, and other Palestinian armed groups could be used to commit or facilitate serious violations of IHRL and IHL, and therefore, in our view, they should not be authorized. I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sasha, for such an important overview. Our third speaker will be Ali Jamil. Ali works as a researcher for Muwatan Organization for Human Rights in Yemen, recently working on a report for arms agreements. Ali will provide an overview of his report, which monitors the weapons that were used in the war in Yemen, and also we are looking for having up-to-date information regarding the humanitarian situation there. Please go ahead. First for you.
Thank you, Paddy. Thank you everyone for coming this day. As Paddy said, I work for Muwatana for Human Rights. Muwatana is a Yemeni local NGO that works on documenting violations to international humanitarian law. Currently, we're working on reports for that will highlight a number of incidents. This report will be in cooperation with PACS and the Legal Clinic of Stanford. The report will highlight a number of deadly and illegal airstrikes, and these incidents, Muwatana was able to identify the origin of weapons. Muwatana documented these incidents and had interviews with victims, relatives of the victims, eyewitnesses, and paramedics. Muwatana has photographs of the remnants of the weapons in these incidents, and we consulted experts of weapons to identify the origins of these weapons. Most of these incidents used American weapons. Some of them used British, German, and Italian weapons. We can say that these are the only origins of weapons that kills people in Yemen, but these are the countries that we have approved that the weapon has been using in killing civilians. Hopefully this report will be published by the end of this year in both Arabic and English language. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. Any question to the speakers? Or Frank? Or Hashan? Please go ahead.
Good morning. Yes, I thank you very much for all the information we got. And on the front presentation, there also what Syria showed is that in this situation, war situation, our friend from United States succeed to
our friend from United States succeed to transfer weapons from the CIA to one arms group, the Pentagon to another one group, and the wall to the so-called, because I'm not agreed to put Islamic in this, but Daesh, ISIS. So that's amazing, and amazing that also we're not very Trump sensibility here, but Trump stopped that. Unfortunately, he continues the flow of the weapons to Saudi Arabia and Emirates, but he stopped this in Syria. On the arms students articles, Action Security Republican, you know, we put a complaint in justice in France against the French government for the arms transfer to the coalition countries held by Saudi Arabia and Emirates. But what is clear, we don't use anymore Article 7. Article 7 begins with if the export is not prohibited until under Article 6. We use Article 7, we could use Article 7 in the beginning of the war, in 2015. Now we do have information, reports from United Nations, from human rights organizations, which show that crimes, war crimes, attack direct against civilian objects or civilian projects, grave breaches of the Geneva Convention of 1949 exist in this war. So I really need to speak with NGOs who are suing their own government in their country based on the ATT, because I saw so much people using the Article 7 is not anymore accurate. And with the lawyers, our lawyers in AZER, in Action Security Republican, we think that we also can use the paragraph 2 of Article 6, which says a state party shall not authorize if any transfer of conventional arms weapons covered under Article 7, if the transfer would violate its relevant international obligation under international agreement, which is a party. So I think also that we are in this situation, and thinking about Article 16, 40, and 41 of Commission Internationale des Lois of the United Nations, December 2001, we need to dig and think together and to bring reflection to build this case, also with paragraph 2. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Maybe briefly, as you know yourself as well, there have been a number of cases where mostly NGOs, both from the region and from European states, have sued their governments. Not always successful, unfortunately, despite the host of evidence that there is. But I'm very interested, especially in the case that was launched earlier this year by Matana and ECCHR in Berlin and the Italian group Rete Disarmo to sue the Italian branch of German company Rheinmetall for sending bombs to Saudi Arabia that were used in Yemen. And I'm still hopeful that in the end, also this legal means, which is a bit of a novel way to try and use the ATT as well as the European Union common position to live up to the standards that they've agreed to. And then for the other thing, I mean, any transfer to the Syrian opposition groups or whatever you want to call them probably have stopped by now, since there's just this tiny patch of Syria that is at the moment not controlled by Syrian forces. But the damage has been done, I think, with so many transfers and retransfers and captures of weapons that the whole country and the whole region, in fact, has a huge abundance of any type of weapon.
Thank you, Frank. Any other question? Please go ahead, Roy.
Hi, Roy Smith from Safe World. Thanks very much to the presenters. All the presentations were fascinating, full of information, very useful to hear. A question I get, or a comment, possibly a question back to Frank on at the end of your presentation when you were talking about end-use certificates and the importance of them, etc. I mean, I think that kind of part of the problem here is that the end-use certificates exist and frequently have existed, and have on some occasions, from my memory of the CAR report, explicitly included no re-export without permission clauses, and yet those transfers took place. The onward transfer took place, and the onward transfer was it strains credibility to suggest that the original exporters were not aware of what the risks were of at least the risks of the transfer were in the end, which suggests that having an end-use certification is not enough. And I've said to you before, and to some people in the room, how frustrating it is that it feels like we've gone back to the 1980s when we had exactly this kind of case happening with weapons sourced out of Eastern Europe, ending up in West Africa. And a lot of work's been done to improve end-use certification down the years, and yet here we are back where we started all that time ago. So it's so I guess the comment is that the end-use certificates are not enough. And so when we hear in the context of the ATT, we hear people talking about end-use certificates and the importance of it, I would agree with that. But again, it seems that's not enough. So a question possibly to Frank, but to other people in the room as well, is what are the extra steps? What are the extra steps that need to be taken so that end-use certificates are the beginning of a process that can have greater effect than seems to be the case in at least some circumstances now?
Any other? Please.
No, I absolutely agree. I think part of the problem of the end user certificates is that they're not legally binding in nature. And so one of the things that we were calling for and still continue to call for is legally binding end use certification, so that if there is a breach of re-export or one of the conditions stipulated in the end user certificates, that there are some kind of penalties or consequences to that. And then something else that came up yesterday in the side event that my colleague Patrick was speaking on was also the responsibility of companies and the need to ensure that contracts, when they're drawn up, are flexible enough to allow for a re-evaluation of the obligations in the contract if new information comes to light, that there are certain, for example, that the weapons have been diverted or they've been used for an unauthorized, they've been used in a way that was not previously agreed. And so there are extra steps that can be taken in terms of the certification itself and the drawing up of the contracts, but then there's also post-delivery checks that could be conducted. I know some states have started to do that, such as Germany, Switzerland, and others. So yeah, I think end user certificates are the beginning of a larger chain of safeguards and mechanisms that need to be put in place to combat diversion.
Please, let's introduce ourselves before asking. It's better for our communication. Please, go ahead.
Thanks. George Williams from Humanitarian. Thank you very much for all your presentations. I'm leading a project at Humanitarian on increasing transparency, oversight and accountability for UAVs. I noticed that you all mentioned UAVs within the various contexts that you were discussing. It's obviously a particular weapons technology that is particularly prominent in the region. A question for you, Ali. Will your research, I recognise it's at the preliminary stages, but will it disaggregate between traditional aircraft strikes and the use of UAVs? And if others have any particular comments on the way that the technology is being used in the region, particular challenges and risks that it presents, then might be particularly grateful to him. Oh, sorry, one other thing. For those particularly interested, we're hosting a side event tomorrow morning to look at the ATT drills from packs and systems and stuff.
Thank you for your question. We have a different report for the drones. Actually, now we're working with the second report of drones. There is one published in 2015, and we're working with another one. Hopefully, will be also published by the end of this year.
Please go on. Only go on.
I'm very University of Bradford, thanks. I'm very, this is a rather technical question, so therefore, since it's technical, I should say I'm very sympathetic to the lines of argument a bit. But it relates to your research, Ali. So obviously, Yemen is now divided into all sorts of different zones. I just wonder how much you're able to assess across Yemen, across the territory of Yemen, the weapons that are used and their sources. You only mentioned 4 states, and my understanding is there are many more than that. And I don't know, but you said you've only found evidence of those 4 states. And I'm surprised, and I wonder whether that's a feature of the particular territories you're looking at, or whether you could elaborate. Because of course I'm very sympathetic to the challenges of doing field research in Yemen. So it's not a criticism, it's in order to understand whether the evidence you're presenting is sort of illustrative, or whether there's some more, whether you can actually say a little bit more than that, because you can cover more than a few areas.
We work in almost all governed rates of Yemen. We have field researchers on most of these governed rates. The report will highlight only the incidents of airstrikes. And in airstrikes, these are the origins of the missiles that we found on field.
So why only airstrikes? Why only airstrikes?
Because they're the most deadly incidents, and maybe in the future we'll work on other patterns of arms transfers.
Any others? Please go ahead.
Hello, Linda Åkerström from Swedish Peace and Arbitration Society. Thank you so much. Obviously, these cases are one of the reasons why ATT was indeed created. And my question is, what are your hopes and recommendations and suggestions for addressing these problems in the process that we are facing, not only this week for the rest of the meeting, but for the coming year during the process up to the next CSP?
Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously, I think I've made Amnesty's position clear on arms exports to Israel and Palestinian on routes. I think my hope in terms of the CSP process itself is that these discussions not be relegated to here, to side events. As useful a platform as these are, I think there needs to be substantive discussion within working groups, within plenary sessions, highlighting cases in which there may be potential treaty violations. And I say that not as an attempt to embarrass states or to single out states or to shame them, but in order to have effective treaty implementation, which is the point of having a treaty, is not to just sign and ratify it and not stand by the letter of the law. It's to actually implement its provisions, and sharing these cases and discussing them will also strengthen treaty implementation and will enable states to share their experiences and their positions and how they've dealt with different scenarios, because obviously not all states deal with with cases in the same way. Some states don't transfer to Israel and others do. So yeah, I guess that's my main hope, is that we're able to have an honest and frank and constructive discussion about these very difficult, and I understand it's difficult that when states are singled out, but these kinds of conversations need to happen in order for the treaty to be implemented effectively.
Maybe, and that's also in response to Roy's remarks, question. Of course, it's not just a technical matter, since most exporting states have their end-use certifications and stuff. It's also, as Russia said, it's a matter of improving it, and as I also tried to emphasize, it's also political will. I think, as I've seen in all these cases, it's either states who've closed their eyes or were willingly blind of the potential consequences of these exports. And on the other hand, I think states have done and can do more in terms of improving post-shipment controls. I understand that both Germany and Switzerland are setting up a kind of post-shipment control system. I think that's very interesting to see how that works. There's of course an abundance of information on how the US has worked on this for many decades, with of course a much bigger system to enforce these controls. And yes, it would be beautiful, I hope, for the coming year if states and researchers and NGOs working on the ATT can use these lessons and learn from each other's experience to try and improve and prevent unauthorized free transfers to areas of conflict, and in general, I would say.
Thank you. So we can have one more question. Please, go ahead.
This is not really a question, it's looking at the reality of the people in Yemen. They want to have peace, and it's about not blaming one supplier or the other, because if the suppliers, illegal suppliers, were on one side, then everybody would come down on that one side. But there are suppliers on both sides. So I think we should, if the arms trade treaty would eliminate both sides from supplying arms, then people in Yemen might have peace.
Please, go ahead.
I think the case in Yemen, Syria, and Iraq is really exposing. It's really exposing how effective this ATT would be. So to me, this is a test, and since we are in the meeting here to discuss about the implementation, diversion, and the rest, I think there is a strong case to table. If people are continuing to die, and those big shots are still supplying, and their market is booming because people are dying, and we are yet saying, putting a blind eye like nothing is happening. I think morally all of us are this, and we need to come up with a statement that need to go to the conference. Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions? Speakers like to add anything? So let us close the seminar saying thank you so much for the three speakers, Rai, Rasha, Ali, and for all of you for coming by early today. Looking for you a fruitful day by participating. Thank you so much.